As you know, we've been in this series called Issues 2016, and we've looked at some of the most pressing and polarizing issues that we face as a country. Here we are in a presidential election season that has been less than, shall we say, civil. Can we agree on that? And as we discuss these issues, our hope was that we could model some kind of civility, some kind of kindness, that we could seek understanding, build a bridge. And so we've done that the best we could. Now, at the same time, we all hold views and opinions, right? And it's not that we pretend like we don't have those opinions. We just don't want to demonize. We don't want to add to the chaos, to the name-calling in our culture. We believe that we can have opinions and stand for something without demonizing the other person. Amen. Does that sound good? And so that's informed our discussion of these issues, and we want it to inform our discussion today. And now I and Pastor Aaron hold a clear opinion on the issue we're talking about today. We're talking about the issue of LGBTQ rights and religious liberty. And as you know, it's a hot-button political issue. And there are those who in our country who believe that their religious liberty entitles them to deny service to people in the LGBTQI population. There's a law firm actually based in Scottsdale that is advancing cases in various states where they're suing the city or they're suing states that do have anti-discrimination laws on behalf of Christian, self-identifying Christian business owners. So, for example, I wrote an op-ed in the Arizona Republic this week about a business that makes products that you could use at a wedding. And they're suing the city of Phoenix because Phoenix has an anti-discrimination law. The state of Arizona does not. So I don't know if you know this. In Arizona, you could be fired for being gay. You can be evicted for being gay in Arizona. But the city of Phoenix says you have to serve everybody and you can't discriminate. Well, they're suing the city of Phoenix because they don't want to serve a potential same-sex couple. Now, that's never happened to them. They haven't been asked, but they're suing the city of Phoenix preemptively. And so this law firm in Scottsdale is defending them. And so I wrote an op-ed talking about my own journey of faith. I was raised in a Christian fundamentalist home on Christian TV every day. So like when other kids were watching Smurfs, I was watching Pat Robertson. You know what I mean? Like Jerry Falwell instead of He-Man. And so I was raised on this steady diet of religious right televangelism. And so back in the day, late 80s, early 90s, whenever Pat Robertson on his show would mention somebody who's gay, they would cut to footage of like the wildest scene in the San Francisco Gay Pride Parade. So somebody's painted blue, it's kind of this picture of revelry, and that was the picture that they wanted to give. They wanted to say, oh, folks are wild, and I thought, man, those people look way more fun than the televangelists. That's the message I got. But they were trying to promote a negative message. And so this has been a hot-button political issue now for several years, and thus far, courts in the United States have ruled that, no, a business can't deny service to the LGBTQI population or any segment of the population based on religious grounds. Our religious freedom doesn't mean that. Our religious freedom does mean, however, that we're free to think as we want to think, and we're also free to change our minds. And so I was free to change my mind and be welcoming to the LGBTQI community because of religious freedom in the United States. And we have people watching the live stream or YouTube later, or some people here, I don't know, but we're all free to change our minds. And so far, that's how American courts have ruled. And so today, we have somebody who's special to me, who's going to be our guest speaker today, Paula Stone Williams. I'm going to give her a proper introduction here in a moment. Paula has gotten involved with the Open Network, which we helped to start. This is a national movement of churches that are kind of like One Church, more progressive evangelical churches. And this movement is taking off. Aaron and I are going to speak there here in a few weeks in Indianapolis at an annual conference. Paula Stone Williams will be there as well. And Paula is a former church planting executive of one of the largest church planting organizations in the United States. And she's brought her expertise to Open. And I told Doug Paget, who was a guest speaker here a year or so ago, I told him, Paula, this is what I said to Doug. I said, Paula is the best thing that has happened to the Open Network. Because without somebody who can help us to start new churches, it's all just talk, right? If you don't have communities on the ground where people can come and have FaceTime and drink coffee together and just do life together, then it's all just kind of an idea out there in the ether somewhere. But if we've got people who can help us to start new communities of faith like this and many other places around the country, now we can make a difference. And everybody who feels alone, like they don't have a church community, they can find one in the city where they live. So Paula's going to share her story today. I've heard some of her story in the past. It's incredibly moving. I invite you to listen with an open heart and give her the warm welcome she deserves. And so I'm going to read her bio and give her a proper introduction. Reverend Dr. Paula Williams was the CEO of one of America's largest church planting organizations. She was also a megachurch preaching pastor, a magazine editor, and a seminary instructor. All ended when she transitioned from Paul to Paula. After 35 years in New York, Paula moved to Lyons, Colorado, where she currently works as a pastoral counselor and church consultant. She also serves with Open, a network of progressive evangelicals, and the Center for Progressive Renewal, both initiatives of convergence. Paula also serves on the board of the Gay Christian Network. For more information about Paula, visit paulastonewilliams.com. And so I invite you to give a very warm welcome to our guest today, Paula Stone Williams. Come on up, Paula.
So I was a very successful, well-educated, white American male. As Ryan said, I was the CEO of the nation's largest church planting organization. We worked nationwide starting new churches. Our new churches averaged 500 at 5 years and 1,000 at 10 years. I also was the editor of a leadership magazine that had about 120,000 subscribers. It had been published every Sunday since 1866, whether it should have been or not. I was on the regular preaching team of 2 megachurches, one in Colorado, one in Pennsylvania. I've preached in 3 of the 10 largest churches in America. I've preached in 2 of the largest churches in the state of Arizona. I've preached in one of the largest churches in your city. I also was a seminary instructor. I've worked at 3 different seminaries, 2 in the United States, 1 in Europe. I was comfortable. Did you ever notice that God has this habit of afflicting the comfortable? God comforts the afflicted. God afflicts the comfortable. I think it's Thomas Merton who said it's a terrible thing to get to the top of the ladder of success, only to realize when you get there that your ladder's been leaning against the wrong wall. I was 3 or 4 years old when I knew I was transgender. In my naivety, I thought I got to choose. And I was quite sure that before I headed off to kindergarten, a gender fairy would show up and would say, "The time has come, choose." And I knew exactly what I would choose. I was a girl, that's what I was. But then the gender fairy never arrived. And I started kindergarten as a boy, and a very tall boy at that. I was not happy. Somebody says, "Well, why didn't you talk to your parents about this?" Very, very good, yeah. My dad was a fundamentalist pastor. My mother was even more conservative than my father. This is a conversation that wasn't going to go well. So I just lived my life. I didn't hate being a boy. I didn't feel like a girl trapped in a boy's body. I've actually never heard a trans person say that. That's media language. I just knew I wasn't a boy. I was about as comfortable playing with girls as I was with boys. I wasn't effeminate at all. Life was okay. I got to junior high school and bodies started changing. And mine was changing in ways I did not want. And all my friends who were females had bodies changing in ways that I did want, and this was not okay. Then we moved from Akron, Ohio to Eastern Kentucky, and for me that was good. There were about 3 kids in my class. 2 of them regularly wore their pants backwards. So, it was one of those kind of places, but it was very comfortable for me. I loved Eastern Kentucky, started dating girls because I was attracted to girls, but then I would have this complication. I would want to date a girl, I would want to be the girl at the same time, which kind of made relationships a little difficult to navigate. I got a job as a disc jockey at 16 years of age. It was a commercial radio station, rock and roll station. I also did play-by-play for basketball. I had enough white entitlement, I thought every 16-year-old boy got hired as a disc jockey at a radio station. And because of that, I got a scholarship offer in broadcasting to the University of Kentucky. I actually was on television for 18 years, most recently just 5 years ago, in 70 markets around the United States. So I love the idea of television and radio, and I wanted to go to the University of Kentucky, but I thought, if I go there, I gotta deal with this. And I can't deal with this. And so instead I went to a Bible college, because I knew there I wouldn't have to deal with anything. I got to the Bible college, and I met this girl, and I wanted to date her, and I did not want to be her. This was very good. I ended up marrying her. I thought that would cure everything. Did not. Shortly after we got married, I told her what I understood at the time, which was virtually nothing. There were no books, there were no TV shows, there was no internet, there was no information anywhere. I remember rushing home from school to watch the Merv Griffin television show in a long time ago. And he was interviewing Christine Jorgensen, who was the very first well-known trans person. And I rushed home just to see that because I needed information. So I told Kathy shortly after we got married, I think we have a problem here. But I was sure I could just keep it on a back burner. We had 3 children. I loved being a dad. It was wonderful. I still like being a dad. My kids still call me dad, which can create complications when you go out to dinner. I love being a father. But then the kids left home, and my gender dysphoria came back with a vengeance. That's what they call it in the DSM-5, gender dysphoria. What is it? What is it not? It's a person who has a consistent, persistent feeling that their gender does not agree with the physical body that they have. That's what gender dysphoria is. What it's not is cross-dressing. Cross-dressing is generally what we call, I'm a pastoral counselor, I have my doctorate in pastoral counseling. Cross-dressing is generally what we call a paraphilia. It's a sexual identity. And most people who are cross-dressers, it's a sexual thing for them. That's not what it means to be transgender. That's not true of all cross-dressers, by the way, but generally speaking, that's what it is. That does not mean they are transgender. It's not drag queens. That's just gay guys having fun. So it's not that. And it has nothing to do with your sexual identity. Your gender identity and your sexual identity are 2 completely different things. Your gender identity is who you want to go to bed as. Your sexual identity is who you want to go to bed with. About 70% of us transgender females are attracted to females. About 30% are attracted to males. So your gender identity doesn't have much to do with your sexual identity. What causes it? Truth is, we really don't know. We know what it's not caused by. It's not genetic. We know that with some confidence. It's not caused by lousy parenting. If you end up with a child who's trans, it's not your fault. We know it is prenatal. And we know it happens in the 2nd trimester of a pregnancy. The end of the 1st trimester of a pregnancy, our body is formed male or female. Every fetus starts out as a female. And for half of us, there's an androgen wash at the end of the 3 months, which turns the person male. The other half remain female. But the brain's connection to the body does not happen until the beginning of the 3rd trimester. And so what we know is there's some kind of a short in the brain development that takes place in the 2nd trimester of pregnancy. In fact, we know, for instance, that women who took DES, a drug that was given to stop miscarriages from the 1930s to the 1970s, those women have sons who are 30 times more likely to be transgender. Not 30% more likely, 30 times more likely to be transgender. My mother took DES. There's an actual condition that's highly unusual, but you might have read about it before, where a person does not create a brain connection to a particular part of their body. It's usually a limb of their body, an arm or a leg. And so to their brain, the arm or leg is experienced as a foreign object. And it causes incredible difficulty to the brain because the brain is constantly saying this shouldn't be here. It's kind of the way you would feel if you had a log sticking out of your head. There would be a constant message to your brain saying this isn't supposed to be here. Well, in the United States, they will not remove that limb. In some other nations, they do. And they know that when they remove the limb, the psychological distress is gone. It's as if the brain says, thank you, I've been telling you all along that's not supposed to be there. Those people do not have the phantom limb you or I would have if we lost a limb, when our brain would continue to say that limb is there. Well, we know that somehow the same thing happens for people who are transgender, so that their brain never makes a connection to their body. So if they're cisgendered male, that means that they're born as males, that their brain is always saying, wait a minute, no, this isn't okay. In fact, studies done just a few years ago on functioning MRIs studied about 1,000 transgender people before they began on hormones, because hormones changes the structure of the brain and how the brain functions. And they discovered that trans people function pretty much halfway between male and female, which most of us would say is pretty much true. So we know when it happens, we don't know exactly what causes it, but we know it's extremely difficult to deal with. 41% of people who are identified with gender dysphoria attempt suicide. 41% of trans people attempt suicide. It's the highest suicide attempt rate of any diagnosis in the DSM-5, 6 times higher than any other diagnosis. 33% succeed in ending their lives. We're only 0.3% of the population. 3 out of every 1,000 people are trans. But it's one of the more difficult diagnoses to have, as we know from the fact that 41% at some point or another in their lives attempt suicide. So the kids left home, and I knew I was in trouble. It came back with a vengeance. I'd been in twice-a-week therapy with your typical New York, I was in New York for years and years, with your typical New York kind of Jewish psychotherapist. She was just wonderful. Been with her twice a week for about 110 years. And we worked through all kinds of stuff. And actually, when we began, neither one of us thought that gender dysphoria or being transgender was a legitimate diagnosis. We thought this was something that could be fixed. But over the years, we both came to understand that it's not. That it is in fact a brain issue. It's a neurological issue. And we came to the point that she said, you're about as individuated as any client I've ever had. You've dealt with all your stuff, and yet this one thing remains, and it's not getting better, it's getting worse. It's time to find someone who specializes in it. And so I did. And at the very first session with that therapist, someone in the room said, I don't think I want to transition genders, but I do think I need to go on hormones. And I was pretty sure it wasn't the therapist who said it, because she's a female. And we were the only 2 in the room, and I experienced it that way. There was this sense of, wait, who said that? I didn't say that, but I did. So I was watching my favorite television show of all time, Lost. Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse were the showrunners of it from my days working in television. I knew how brilliant their work was. Carlton Cuse, by the way, is a very committed Catholic, and so there's a lot of Christian typology in that show if you are a Lost fan. So it was the final season of Lost, and the protagonist of the show, Jack, comes to a point where he realizes he's been called by God to die. For those of you who were Lost fans, that's when he goes to the lighthouse. And when I watched that show, I started sobbing. And I cried and cried and cried all the way through the night to the next morning. Because I knew I'd been called. It's the first time in my life I experienced a strong sense of call from God. And I kept screaming and yelling at God, who do you think you are to have made me this way? Who do you think you are to do this to me? Don't you know this is going to ruin my life? This is going to be impossible. My family's going to go through horrible times. But I knew I'd been called. And you reject the call of God at your own peril. So I started hormones, and I was hoping that a low dose of hormones might settle my brain down. Sometimes that works. It's enough to cause the brain to say, thank you, I've been telling you for a long time you're supposed to have this. But in my case, I went back to the doctor after about 3 months, and she said, oh, we have a problem here. Your body is changing much too rapidly. Your body is changing the way I would expect a 12-year-old or 13-year-old body to change. You're not going to be able to stay on even this level of medication, or within 6 months, you're not going to look like a guy anymore. And so I had a decision to make, and I knew I had been called. And so I told the organizations with which I'd worked. The church planting organization, I was with them for 35 years. I took them from a budget of $167,000 to a budget of $4 million, from working just in the New York City area to working worldwide, to becoming one of the largest church planting organizations in the world. I told them I was transgender. At this point, I wasn't sure I was going to transition. I just told them I was transgender. In 7 days, I was gone. Gone. The magazine that I edited, gone. Television work, we'd already sold the network, but what remained of that was gone. My teaching position at 3 different seminaries, gone. Everything was gone within 7 days. Gone. There are 22 states where you have legal rights as a trans person. There are 28 states in which you do not. Arizona is one of the 28 states. But in even those 22 states, if you work for a religious organization, you can be fired for any reason, because they couldn't have gotten their laws passed if they didn't make that exemption for religious organizations. So I lost everything. I was a leader in the evangelical world. I probably knew 5,000 to 10,000 people by name, including probably, maybe 100 here in the area. Good friends with several of the megachurch senior pastors right here in your state, people whose names you know. Of those 5,000 to 10,000 people, you know how many I've heard from since I came out as trans? 50. Well, actually, I've heard from many, many of them in not very kind ways. Because once I knew I actually needed to transition, I came out, and the day I came out as female, on my website, there were 65,000 page views, and most of those people were really, really angry. In fact, the angriest email I got was from the president of a Christian university. I thought, well, that's nice. I probably knew by name 5,000 to 10,000 people. 50 of them have contacted me in a nice way. 18 have met me 6 more than once. My world disappeared. Of my non-Christian friends, you know how many I lost? Are you ready? None. Not any. None. It is what it is. You know, there are a lot of people who are opposed to trans issues, and particularly in the evangelical world, they like to seize on the work of Paul McHugh, a psychiatrist who once taught at Johns Hopkins, who is the only psychiatrist in the Western world who does not think that gender dysphoria is a legitimate diagnosis. He says, in fact, if you take a look at the statistics, after they transition genders, there still is a 35% suicidal ideation rate. Well, first of all, there's a difference between a 41% suicide attempt rate and a 35% suicidal ideation rate. That means you're seriously considering it, but it is true. There is, within 18 months after transition, a 35% suicidal ideation rate, but he doesn't bother to talk about the reason. It has nothing to do with how you feel in your new gender. It has to do with how the world responds to you. If you are a successful white American male, well-educated, and you don't lose your job, and you don't lose your friends, and your family stays and is supportive, do you know what your post-transition suicidal ideation is? 1.4%, less than the population at large. If you are a teen of color, and you come from a religious background, and your parents are not supportive of you, your post-transition suicide attempt rate is 57%. It's the most at-risk population in the United States. The problem is not in the person experiencing their new gender. The problem is how they're received by the world. And when the world rejects them, when their world rejects them, they internalize that transphobia. And when they internalize the transphobia, that's when they are in danger. And who's the worst at causing us to internalize transphobia? 83% of the Jewish population in the U.S. is supportive of LGBTQI people. 83%. Good for the Jewish population. 61% of the Catholic population in the United States is. But then it's not a democracy. So, 62% of mainline Protestants, that's Presbyterian Church in the USA, the Episcopal Church, the United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which actually isn't evangelical, it gets complicated. 62% of those denominations supportive of LGBTQI rights. 51% of African American churches are supportive of LGBTQI rights. Among evangelicals, it's 27%. Evangelicals are, in fact, the biggest opponents of marriage equality. Now, interestingly, if you're a millennial evangelical, they're 51% supportive of LGBTQ rights. So one of the most at-risk populations are people who are evangelical, who are transgender, because there are very, very few safe places for them. So I transitioned. It was difficult for my wife. We've been married a lot of years. It was difficult for my 3 children. My son is a pastor of a church in New York City with 2 campuses, one in Manhattan, one in Brooklyn, church of about 800 people. My 2 daughters were both in children's ministry. One of them was a children's pastor at one of the biggest churches close to here, a church in Mesa. For my girls, it was tough. For my son, it was really, really tough. We were super, super close. I was talking to him just a few weeks ago, and I said, I thought I prepared you for disappointment in life by making you a New York Mets fan. I thought that this would be adequate to prepare for whatever might come. It was hard. It was difficult. We're super close now. My son and I both work together. He's very involved with Open. His church is Open and Affirming. In fact, we're doing sessions together at the Open conference in a couple of weeks. It's been great. Kathy and I are still together. We're still legally married, but we no longer consider ourselves to be husband and wife because basically, bottom line is, I'm a lesbian and she's not. In fact, we went to a marriage therapist who was, in fact, the most brilliant man I've ever known in my life. He was ancient, he was Jewish, his last name was Solomon. It was too perfect. It was like a movie script. So he retired, and we were his last clients on his last day. I'm not sure that's what he wanted on his last day. I asked him the question, because my spouse and I are both therapists. I said, okay, so how many couples are willing to work this hard? He said about 1%. Didn't hesitate. Said, how many couples get this far in working through their stuff? He said, yeah, 1%. Which is just what makes this so tragic. Because you're a lesbian and she's not, and we don't get to choose what our sexual identity is. So we're still together, but it's difficult, it's hard. I thought I would not be in the church ever again. I thought I was done with the church. But then a friend of mine introduced me to Mark Tidd, who'd started a church in Denver called Highlands Church. We had lunch for 2 or 3 hours, and he said, when you feel like it, come check it out. Style is evangelical. Theology's not. So I went. It was June. I sobbed and sobbed throughout the entire service because I realized for the second time in my life, I'd been called back to the church. It's like, seriously, God, really? Have you taken notice of what the church has done to me? But I knew I was called. And you reject the call of God at your own peril. Within 2 months, I was preaching there. I'll be preaching there in 2 weeks. I'm chairing the committee that's starting a new church, and I'll be one of the preaching pastors at that new church that'll be started in the Boulder area. God has been tremendously good. It is good to be you, even when being you is difficult. My favorite poem is from the Pulitzer Prize winner Mary Oliver. It's called A Journey, and it goes like this. One day, you knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. Mend my life. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do. Though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible, it was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. Thanks.
Goodness gracious. Thank you so much for your sharing, Paula. And for some of us, it may be the first time we've heard somebody who identifies as transgendered share their story. And folks have questions, and at the same time, there is an openness and to understanding what your journey has been. So I just really appreciate you sharing. Is it okay if I ask you a few questions?
Sure.
You mentioned briefly the effect that your transitions had on your family. So I know Jonathan, very talented pastor, about the same age. Do you want to say more about that? How has your transition affected your family?
One of the things I say to people who are transgender is, if you don't have to transition, don't. Because it's going to be harder on your family than you think. That's the one thing that I think all of us tend to underestimate, because we've been living with it our whole lives. And even though Kathy had been living with it for decades, still it was devastating to actually do it, because it fundamentally changes. I would say to my kids shortly after I transition, I would say, I'm the same person, and they would say, actually, you're not. And it's like, yeah, I'm not. I lecture a lot at the University of Colorado, and a student asked me a couple of weeks ago, said, so if you woke up tomorrow morning and you thought to yourself, oh, I'm not really trans, I didn't have to do this, what would your first thought be? And I said, my first thought would be that I'm a better person now. It's interesting, all my counseling clients, I arranged for all of them to have other therapists. None of them left. They all stayed with me. But then, within 6 months, pretty much all of them said, we like you better now. It's like, really? Was I that bad before? I said, no, you just weren't you before. But it is tough. It's super hard on a family. And it's never okay. It's really just never okay. Imagine if your spouse transitioned. That's not what you signed up for.
Yeah, and you've been sensitive, and I know it's been a journey. So that's a little bit about their experience of their world and with you in it. Now you've experienced, this is just an interesting thing that may not occur to everybody, but you have now experienced living in America as both a male and a female, which opens up the door for a conversation about how men and women can understand each other better and our experiences of society in all kinds of ways, right? Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, the first thing I have to say to every cisgendered female in the room is, I'm so sorry. I'm just so sorry. There is no way, sorry, I'm so sorry, but there's no way that a well-educated, successful white American male can understand how much the culture is tilted in his favor. There's no way for him to know how relatively easy it is for him.
I see a lot of nodding heads right now.
Yeah. The very first time I flew as Paula, I have 2.5 million miles with American. I spent half my life in the Phoenix airport because it was actually with US Airways. So the very first time I flew as Paula, I always have the free upgrades. And so I was late getting on the plane because I was talking to my friends who work for the airline. And so I get on after most of the people have gotten on in first class. And I'm in the very first row. If you ever get on an American flight out of Phoenix, you can look for me in 1D. I'm in the first row on the right side. And there was stuff in my seat. And so I picked it up and held it and put my stuff down. And a guy said, "That's my stuff." I said, "I know, but it's in my seat." He said, "That's my seat." I said, "Actually, it's not, but I'll hold it for you till you find your seat, and then I'll give it to you." He said, "That's my seat." I said, "Actually, it's not, but I'll hold it for you until you find your seat, and then everything will be fine." Now, if that ever happened to Paul, and it did, and I would have said, "That's my seat," I can tell you what would have happened. Instantly, the person would have said, oh, let me look at my boarding pass. Even if I was in the wrong seat, they would have said that.
Right, yeah.
So one more time, he says, "Lady, that's my seat." And I said, "Well, actually, it's not. It's my seat." So the guy behind me at this point says, "Lady, could you take your effing argument someplace else so I could get on the airplane?" So the flight attendant now decided to do her job, and she asked for my boarding pass and the other person's, and then she said to the man, "Actually, she's in 1D, you're in 1C. Not a word from him, not a word. So I put his stuff in 1C, I sit down. "Mister, would you take your effing argument elsewhere?" Actually was in 1F next to me. It was delightful. So Karen, who I've known for decades, who works for American, comes on to give the pilot his paperwork, and she goes back by the door and looks at me and mouths the words, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No." And she said, "What?" And I just went. So I got to Charlotte, and I had a call from her, said, "Give me a call." So I called, and she said, "I flagged both of their records. What do I need to say?" Well, you don't want an airline to flag your record, because you get 3 of those, and you're invited never to fly the airline again. So I got justice. But I asked her, I said, a couple weeks later, I said, "So Karen, did you do that for me because you felt badly for Paula, or did you do that because you knew Paul for all those years? Because you had a relationship with this successful businessman?" And she said, "No, I think I would have done the same thing for Paula that I would have done for Paul." She said, "But actually, if you'd always been Paula, I wouldn't have known that it happened." I said, "What?" And she said, "Well, when I saw you, you were white. You were like stunned. If you'd always been Paula, you just would have said, 'Bye, Karen,' because you would have been accustomed to being treated that way." Oh my goodness, she's right. She's absolutely right. Instantly, do you know I don't know anything? I'm an idiot now. I was flying from LAX to Honolulu, and it was a horrible, horrible, horrible flight. It was just, terrible turbulence, and the woman next to me was actually quite scared. And she said, "This is frightening." And I said, "Actually, we're in an A321, and a 321 doesn't actually have the power. It's underpowered, so it can't fly above the weather. Plus, it barely has the range for this trip, so we can't fly around it." She looked at me like I had 3 heads. Male flight attendant comes along. She says, "Why is this so bad? Why is it so bad?" And he said, "Yeah, we can't fly above it." She's like, "Oh." I'm like, "No, wait. I just explained to you why we can't fly above it, but I'm an idiot who doesn't know anything." I mean, if I've said it once to Kathy, I've said it 150 times. "I'm so sorry." How long it takes to get ready in the morning. The fact that your skin is thinner, so you're colder. Didn't know that. It's also why females have cellulite and males don't, because their skin is thinner. Oh, there's a million things I've learned.
Wow.
That's a long answer.
Well, it's informative, that's for sure, for all of us here. To the wider issue that is the topic of the day with LGBTQI rights and religious liberty. Here you are now, somebody who's been a religious spiritual leader for years and years, and now you're experiencing life in this new way. What comments do you have about this debate between religious liberty and LGBTQI rights?
You know, you can take something like this incredibly personally, or you can take a macro view. I choose to take the macro view and not take it personally. Like just a little quick story. E.O. Wilson is a sociobiologist at Harvard University and MIT. He's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, so he's kind of smart. And he identified what he called 9 species that are different from every other species. He called them eusocial species, E-U-S-O-C-I-A-L species. And he says what sets these 9 species apart is that unlike every other species, they don't have just a selfish gene, which every species has, what Richard Dawkins called a selfish gene. These 9 species also have a tribal gene, that they will sacrifice themselves for the sake of their tribe. He said, but in 8 of these 9 species, an enemy comes into the tribe, they unite, they defeat the enemy, some will sacrifice themselves, the enemy is gone, life goes on. He said, unfortunately, in 1 of the 9 species, it has evolved in such a way to believe it must have an enemy for the tribe to survive. The tribe needs an enemy to be able to survive. And so when no enemy exists, we create one. That would be us, humans. And Wilson says if we don't get a hold of that, we'll lose the species and probably lose the planet because of our power. This sense that we need to create enemies where they don't exist.
Yeah.
Now, the anthropologist and philosopher René Girard took that a step further. He started looking at power structures inside tribes and said within tribes, people want to keep their power, and over the eons, they discovered the absolute best way to keep your power is to create an enemy inside the camp, a scapegoat. Because we have an enemy in the camp. If we have an enemy in the camp, well, we can't change power structures now. You need to leave me in power so we can eradicate this enemy. So they create scapegoats that don't exist and drive them out because they can maintain their power.
Yeah.
In fact, he says if you take a look at all the meta-narratives are big giant stories that explain the meaning of life. He said if you look at all of them were written by the winners. Most of them written by men. All of them were written by the victors of the wars. The ones who get to write history are the ones who win. He says, but it's interesting because there's one meta-narrative, one big giant story that goes against the grain. He was not a Christian, by the way. He said there's one meta-narrative, only one, in the history of mankind, written from the perspective of the scapegoat. And said if we could actually follow the teachings of that scapegoat, we could turn the course of humanity. He said, no, not the religion created by that scapegoat, because that religion has become like every other tribe. It creates enemies where none exist. It creates scapegoats and kicks them out. But he said if we could follow the teachings of the scapegoat, we could change the course of humanity, and of course that scapegoat is Jesus. That's why I'm a Christian, because that's where the hope lies. That says God is love. We're all normal. You know, when we go into the restroom, we're going there because we want to go to the restroom. Do you know how many people actually, trans people, have attacked someone in a restroom? None. Anywhere in the world. And yet the state of North Carolina seems to think we're a huge threat. So I'm a blogger for the Huffington Post. If you go back to the Huffington Post and you look, you'll see a picture of me next to a urinal. And the caption is obeying the law in North Carolina. Created quite a stir. It's, you know, we're kind of normal folks. I mean, it's weird. Got to be honest, it's weird. It's just weird. You know, if you're trans and you can't acknowledge it's weird, well, then get your act together. You know, do your work. I mean, it's hard for us to get our arms around this. But we're here. We exist. As a psychotherapist, I know that we have no greater or lesser diagnoses of other kinds of mental illness than anybody else. We're normal people. We just had brains that didn't develop right in the second trimester of a pregnancy.
You've been so open. You've shared so personally, and now you are still this church planting expert. That hasn't changed.
Well, I know a lot of stuff.
Yeah. And so the first time you and I talked on the phone, I was on my way to San Diego to hang out with some friends, and we were going through the mountains on the 8, and we kept losing contact and calling each other back. And I thought, oh, how great this is, because now this little fledgling movement has somebody who knows all the church planting data, is from that world that I have been in as well. And so I was so excited that you have connected with this movement, and still am. And so just last question. What do you see as the future of church planting with churches like this in the open network around the United States?
You know, the population is so ready for this. I mean, we already know 51% of millennials don't have a problem with marriage equality.
Yeah.
So the opportunities are huge. I mean, the church is going to shift on this. It's shifted on every other subject. Galileo was put in house arrest because he believed that the earth revolved around the sun.
Right.
That doesn't happen anymore.
Right. That's right.
Church doesn't take a stand in favor of slavery any longer. Even in my lifetime, you couldn't be a part of a church if you were divorced and remarried. When's the last time you heard that? The church moves. It's just filled with a lot of frightened people, and so it takes longer to move than other environments.
Yeah.
The future's good. And by the way, as somebody who knows new churches, I walk in here, I look at the facility, I look at how it feels, I look at the people, and guess what? You're really healthy. This church is going to grow. It's going to grow in neat ways. I mean, it's like, oh my goodness, they did this right. They know what they're doing. And I am not always that kind.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Well, on that note, everybody, let's express our appreciation to Paula Stone Williams. Thank you so much.
Thank you.